Can you hear me? Amazing. Hello, hello. Welcome back. You're in the right session. I've counted the other day that this is my 7th session at the Learning Technologies Conference and Exhibition. Not 7th session, 7th year attending. And here's what happens each year. The conference comes to an end. We all get drinks. And then we ask each other, very often, this first question: how did you find it? How did you find the conference? And the answer you would very often get is that, well, these were all great ideas. These are amazing technologies. But how do I do it in practice? How do I do it? The thing is that I would love to create a learning culture. I would love to get a seat at the table. I would love for my L&D function to become a strategic business partner. Do you know anyone who has done it successfully? Well, hopefully, today's drinks are going to be different. Because today, we have with us Mark Howells. Mark is the Vice President of Talent and Development at AstraZeneca, and he and his team have transformed their learning function from one focused on training delivery to a real, true strategic business partner. This session is going to be run a bit differently because I think it's very important and useful for all of us to hear Mark's full story. With all of its complexities and nuances, it's going to be a rich one. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend the first around 40 minutes listening to Mark's story, and then we're going to go into the Q&A for the remaining 30 minutes, the Q&A from you. Sound good? OK, amazing. So without further teasing, I present to you Mark Howells.
Good morning. And thrilled to be here today to have an opportunity to talk about the journey that my team and I have been on. Just as a quick introduction, I look after all talent succession, learning technology, organizational development, and leadership for the company. I'll tell you a little bit more about AstraZeneca. I know most people have heard the name because of the vaccine, but there's a little bit more to AZ than the vaccine activity. I'm also thrilled that some of the team that were involved in the work are also here today, so they'll keep me honest. If I make any stuff up, I'm sure they'll tell me that I made that up. But let me get going. So what I was planning to do today is just give you a little bit of context about the company, what we do, what we were trying to achieve. Then go into how we approached it. So why did we undertake this piece of work around the whole learning and talent transformation? What were some of the lessons that we did? So I'll explore some of the processes and the methodologies that we adopted, what worked, what didn't work, where we got some of the successes, and also then thinking about what was the impact, because the impact was critical for us in thinking about the so what. It's a very performance-orientated organization, and making sure that this wasn't just about a feel-good factor. This had to drive tangible performance impact for the organization in the context of what we were striving for holistically. And then I'll talk to you about what we're doing next. So what are the next steps that we're embarking on now, how that's going, and would love to hear some of your thoughts and reflections and also some of your experiences as we close out. So let me start with just sharing a little bit about AstraZeneca. So AstraZeneca is an innovative biopharmaceutical company. We have a turnover of just shy of $45 billion. We're a market capitalization of nearly $190 billion. We're the 6th biggest pharma company in the world. We've got just under 85,000 permanent employees, but we also have nearly 30,000 contingent workers on top of that, so a fairly sizable population. But that population is also spread. So we have a presence in over 105 different countries globally. So it's truly a global organization. And that comes with its challenges. We also have 33 different languages in the company, despite English being the primary language. 80% of the population are contained within 12 languages, and that'll be relevant for what I talk about later. And then outside of that, we serve approximately 105 million patients a year with our core therapeutic business. But in addition to that, with the work that we did around the vaccine, We also touched on nearly 3 billion patients globally with the COVID vaccine, and something the company and all its employees feel incredibly proud of the work that we did during that period. And then in terms of where we're located, we have a number of primary strategic sites. One is in Maryland in the US, just outside of Washington, DC. The other one is in Gothenburg, Sweden, and we have Cambridge in the UK. They're the key sites, and we recently acquired another company called Alexion, which is a rare disease business, and we now have a scientific hub in Boston in the US. So they're the key global locations for the organization across the US, UK, and Sweden. But in addition to that, if you look at the footprint of the company, the two biggest locations for us in numbers are the US, where we have about 14,000 people, and China, where we have 16,000 people. So we're the biggest pharmaceutical company in China and with a significant footprint, but it also makes up nearly a quarter of our revenue as a company. So you can see the scale of the organization. So in terms of what the organization is focused on, as I said, we're an innovation-led organization. So science and patients are at the heart of everything that we do. And somebody said to me recently, a senior leader that joined from another purpose-led organization but working in FMCG. And she said that she was very conscious of the purpose of the organization she'd come from. But when she joined AstraZeneca, she said it's like a giant walking the corridors. You just can't get away from it. The patient conversation is everywhere. The drive for the investment in science and innovation comes across in everything that we do. And that underpins the 5 key areas that we're focused on as a company, which is oncology, so cancer, cardiovascular, renal and metabolism, respiratory and immunology, rare disease, and then vaccines and immunotherapy is the recent ones. And you've seen that through the COVID work that we've done. We've also got a diversified portfolio. So as I mentioned earlier, we cover a significant number of markets, but key focuses in some of emerging markets, Europe and the US. Global strength in the balanced portfolio that we have. So again, we're not just about one particular therapy area. We try and balance the work that we do across all of these therapy areas here. And then the other is about a significant commitment to people and planet. So the organization has invested significantly in trying to create a great place to work for the very best talent. But in addition to that, it's thinking about our footprint as an organization on the planet. So a big drive on the ESG strategy, patient focus, patient advocacy. So all of these contributed to our thinking about the learning transformation. So, people dynamics are changing. I think everyone in the room will recognize these themes and probably things that you're also engaging with. Technology is accelerating innovation. And when you look at where we are today with AI, ChatGPT, I think we're at the cusp of the next big technological breakthrough. And this is going to impact everything that we do and everything that we thought we were doing in terms of supporting our people and data. Changing nature of work. COVID has changed the paradigm completely in the way that we think about hybrid working, how people want to work, where they want to work, how flexibility plays into that. How do we connect people when they are working together? And then societal changes. Again, expectations have moved on significantly in recent years. How people want to be recognized, how they want to be reskilled, how they want to be engaged. We heard some great sessions this morning about the sustainability agenda and how that's playing into teaching, learning, and adapting skills. So all of these played into some of the themes about why we wanted to move the agenda. Back in 2019, AstraZeneca had developed a new strategy to take us out to 2025. This new strategy was being launched, but one of the things that we recognized, and as I came into the role, we started to think about what were some of the challenges that we were facing at the time. So what we were finding as we started to explore was First of all, there were gaps in succession pipelines. When I think about talent for the organization, I think of it in a very similar way to the way that we look at our drug pipeline. We have early molecules that we then progress through different stages of research until we get to what's called phase 3, which is clinical trials. And then you get into a commercialized product that then is safe and launched into the population. For us, we need to think about, are we developing early talent, mid-talent, senior talent, and then essentially the equivalent of the phase 3 into the commercial environment would be our C-suite candidates that we're building for that pipeline. What I found was that we had a shortage and we had gaps in some key areas. And we needed to ensure that we had a way of really driving that and connecting talent to the organization. We had inconsistent leader and management development. When I first started in the role, we had over 300 vendors supporting us with leader and management development. It's like I could have literally picked any vendor and known that they were working with AstraZeneca. And honestly, they were all working as if we were a small company and charging us the very best rates that they could get with. And sometimes it's a little bit like when somebody says there's a wedding venue. You mention the word farm and there's a special price list that comes out, and we needed to sort that out as well. We had complex learning technology, and the team here can attest to that, is that we had 75 different learning platforms in play in 2019. I can guarantee nobody wants 75 learning platforms. On top of that, they didn't talk to each other. So I couldn't get any data apart from going into each one individually. We had very event-based learning. So again, it was not connected to the strategy, it wasn't connected to the purpose, and it wasn't creating consistent experiences that drove belonging in terms of our employee population and how that connected to what AstraZeneca's purpose was trying to achieve. Huge emphasis on compliance reporting. Challenge was that we were using our LMS as a dumping ground for every kind of training. It was not being updated, therefore it was difficult to navigate, and was becoming a repository for a lot of outdated material and content that actually could be quite damaging if people started using it. Learning organization was hugely decentralized. No connectivity whatsoever. Every function was doing their own thing, completely different agendas, no alignment in terms of what the experience would look like, let alone what the focus areas of attention would be in terms of the investment of the content. And then I had Deloitte come and do a piece of work for us to look at where we stood against the HILO, the High Impact Learning Organization assessment that Burson had developed. And what we found was that we were ranging between 1 and 1.5. It's on a 1 to 4 scales, 4 being the highest maturity. So we were achieving a 1 to 1.5 across the 5 measures, but we were achieving a level 4 in terms of spend. We were actually higher than level 4. So with the highest level of spend, lowest level of maturity, highest level of disaggregation. So we had a bit of work to do. So all of this gave us an opportunity to then stand back and think about what is it that we wanted to achieve? What was the promise to the organization and what was the value proposition? So what we were trying to do was ensure that we then connected the talent strategy to the business strategy and to ensure that we had the right capabilities in the right place at the right time to service the business need. And as I mentioned earlier, think of our talent pipeline like the drug pipeline. What is our discovery process for talent? We also re-baselined the talent philosophy for the organization. So we moved away from the concept of the top 5%, and we started to talk about the fact that everybody is talent, but it's more about potential. Everybody has the potential to grow and develop to be a better version of themselves and to adapt. Some have higher potential, which means that we need to accelerate that and develop and move it forward. We wanted world-class leader and manager development. We needed to make sure that if we were attracting and retaining the very best people in the market, the very brightest minds in science to try and help us develop the drug pipeline, and service our patients, we had to create a compelling environment that meant they were getting invested in at the same rate, that they felt they were getting access to the very best development that would stretch and find their potential. We had to simplify the learning technology. It just wasn't good enough. It was chaotic. The learning management framework also had to be played in so that to understand exactly how we were using it, where we were being intentional, and how it spoke to each other and connected all the different parts of it. We need to be data-driven. The fact that I couldn't get access to any data or be able to give a readout meant that essentially I can't tell a story of where we stood. I couldn't tell a story of where the gap was, I couldn't tell a story of the progress, and I couldn't tell the story of the impact. And that had to be something that we resolved in a future state model. We also had to have, as I mentioned earlier, because of the scale and the complexity of the organization, we need to ensure we had a governance model that worked hand in glove with my team and my organization to support us in building the case for the business, but also to pull this through. And then at the end of it, we didn't have a target specifically in terms of cost, but what we were trying to do was ensure that we created value for the business. So in the scale of a $45 billion revenue company, what we spend on learning is still a tiny amount. But it has to be value creating, because any dollar that we're spending unnecessarily on this activity is not being spent on drug development and drug innovation for patients. And it's about thinking about that connectivity to purpose in everything we do. It's about being meaningful, purposeful, and intentional in the work that we were doing. So ultimately, the vision that we had for the learning was that we were going to create a culture of lifelong learning. Now, one of the things we talked about was the pace of change in technology, the pace of skills change across all industries. We're fortunate. We primarily deal with chemistry and biology. Our shelf life of skills is about 5 to 7 years. If I talk to engineering companies, or I talk to the supply and manufacturing group in our organization, it's probably somewhere between 3 and 5 years. If I talk to peers in other companies like tech, Microsoft, 18 months, 24 months. So the piece that we had to embed in the culture was about make learning agility your superpower. It's the one future-proof skill that everybody can develop. Because whatever you're doing today, I can guarantee that in 5 years' time, none of us will be doing the same thing in the same way. It will have changed, it will have evolved. And unless we can breed a culture of learning in the organization, this wasn't going to enable us to stay agile as we look to the future. We needed to create enterprise and professional capabilities that were highly aligned to the company priorities and the vision. What were the things that we really needed people to be able to do in the organization? How did we want leaders to think in an enterprise way? So breaking out of silos to think about ecosystems, to think cross-boundary, to think beyond the boundary of AstraZeneca, to engaging with academia, with not-for-profit, with government, but particularly with each other across the functions. We wanted to create a learner experience that was consumer grade. Every single one of us here probably has a smartphone. We go in there, it's intuitive, nobody teaches you, you don't download a development program and sit there for an hour figuring out how to use it. It's built in a way that means you can connect it, you can navigate it, and you can get value from it. We need to think about the same type of experience for learners, because it goes back to the philosophy of learning in the flow of work means it needs to be smart, it needs to be intentional, but it needs to be agile so that it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, whatever time you've got. It can't be something that requires huge investment of time, otherwise you lose that moment of engagement. And then finally was about measuring the impact. So again, this was starting to think about when we looked at metrics for learning. We have the usual sort of metrics everybody turns to about satisfaction levels, engagement. But what I wanted to understand was, were individuals that went through our learning interventions staying longer? Were they being promoted faster? Were they more agile in their skill set? Were they better coaches? Did they create better psychological safety in the environments that they led? Were they able to adapt to technology through understanding of the digital platforms and the digital lexicon that we built? These would be things that we would come back to later on to really underpin what was the value proposition, and then to balance, ultimately, a cost element, but to see what could we create without adding cost but increase value. So we move to what we did. So one of the things we started with was we looked at trying to take on a portfolio activity. So one of the things that we considered was there was a real need for a sense of urgency. How do we accelerate the work that we do? Because while we were figuring out this challenge, the business and our employees and our leaders were trying to solve complex innovation, scientific issues to solve needs for unmet medical need for patients. So we decided that we weren't going to go in a linear way, that we would take on a multi-swim lane approach to the program. And we started thinking about how could we build these different elements here. So one was we wanted to move away from, as an organization, performance management. Even forgotten how to say performance management. We wanted to move from performance management to performance development. Change the conversation away from ratings. We were going to abandon ratings, but we needed to create capability in our leaders to be able to engage with different conversations, coaching conversations. We wanted to move from feedback to feed forward. How do you build from a position of strength, and how do you look at opportunities in front of you that you can realize greater contribution in the next opportunity versus describing something that happened 6 months ago that somebody's probably forgotten and the facts are all a little bit hazy, but it feels like somebody's been chastised as opposed to being grown towards the next opportunity. We then wanted to look at operating model and governance. So how would we organize ourselves in order to bring this model to life, to ensure that we had agility in the business intimacy and understanding the needs of the business, subject matter expertise, technical capability, project management capability, but an ability to orchestrate this in an agile way. We then looked at the talent management and succession processes. So again, we re-baselined all of those and did some engagement, and I'll come back in more detail. And then we started thinking about enterprise capabilities, as I mentioned earlier, leader and manager offering, and bringing all of these themes under one umbrella that we could engage with the organization. We've all been talking about the 70-20-10 model for a number of years. And it's something that most people remember, they can engage with, but we felt that we needed a slightly different take on that would just re-energize the conversation, update it to where we wanted to focus, and think about how we could speak to this in a different way as we then started building different offerings across the organization. So we moved to a model called the 3 E's framework, which is about experience, exposure, and education. And started to couch our offering in this way, but also talking to the learning culture and a culture of lifelong learning. So when you're thinking about your own experiences, we started to spotlight how we were going to think about the 3 E's as a way of bringing learning into day-to-day activities, not something that somebody plans for in 6 months' time. So make it a living activity as you go forward. We also needed to address some of the fundamentals of how our technology, our content, and learning was architected and orchestrated. So we needed clear learning content management, ensuring that when something was hosted somewhere, you could find it, you could source it, you could think about knowledge management, not just a dumping ground for 1,000,001 different PowerPoint decks. Enterprise Content Management System then moved into streamlining the documentation and document management. Again, it's a very compliance-driven organization. It's an organization that's in a highly regulated industry. And therefore, when we're audited in our manufacturing plants or when we make regulatory submissions, it's critical that the data is accurate, it's up to date, and the learning records mean something to the people that are involved in the different processes. We needed dashboards. Yeah, the idea of having a dashboard that I could just go into and see live readouts of where we stood on different activities, different skills, this was the ambition that we were looking for. This was also reinforced by the business in terms of what they were asking for and what they wanted to see from us. Global content libraries. This came back to the theme that one of the ambitions we had was, how do we democratize learning? So if you go back to the concept of learning agility as a superpower that we wanted to create in the organization and a philosophy that we wanted people to engage with, one of the things that we recognized early on was there were many silos between different functions and different business units. But if we want people to learn and engage in learning, why would you stop an accountant learning about medical affairs? Why would you prevent somebody in operations learning about rare disease or cancer cells? How can you create that curiosity, but a boundaryless level of curiosity in the organization that means that people can learn any content? You can create pathways that enable them to follow work that is relevant to them, but it encourages a learning behavior that then becomes habitual. And this was part of what we wanted to do, was by creating an environment that was open source internally, without boundaries, but also enabled by content libraries, this would start to stimulate that behavior of creating a culture of learning and an appetite for curiosity. And then we wanted to create, essentially, a marketing playbook that was a clear offering to the organization. So it's a little bit like if you went in to buy some services from a vendor, they would have a catalogue of services that you go through and you pick some services and you engage in a conversation. We wanted that experience for our learners internally and therefore built a digital portfolio around that offering so that people knew what they were going into, what it would look like. There'd be a short video, there'd be a descriptor, there'd then be a piece of feedback from somebody that had already undertaken the learning, so you can get a sense of, is that the right thing for me? It also had a digital wizard that meant that if you could put in some parameters, it would take you to the most relevant learning to help navigate your way through that. So I'll move a little bit into more of what we focused on in terms of the undertaking of the activity itself. And this is where we found some of the sort of more interesting elements of the challenge of how to drive the transformation. So I think one of the things that we did that I'm really proud of and went well at the beginning was we set up an enterprise learning board for the organization. This was chaired by our CHRO and myself, and I had senior vice presidents from the business, from every single business unit present on the Enterprise Learning Board. People that had a reputation for being passionate about people agenda, but not experts in learning by any shape or form, but influencers within their organizations. People that had a voice that would be heard, but also would bring support and challenge to the conversation as we started to navigate this journey of the transformation. We also looked at the operating model. So I have now talent and development directors that face into every single business unit. These are sort of senior director level, very credible, deep expertise, but they essentially are the key account managers for every business unit. And they were responsible for starting to gather insights from the business area as to what are they looking for, what is their business strategy, what are their people needs, and ultimately, what are the learning and development needs that come out of that, and how can we facilitate and support that need. We also had so in terms of the governance model, I talked about the fact that we had these senior leaders. Now, they were great in terms of the advocacy and thinking about enterprise leadership, but we also needed what we called the Learning Advisory Board. So these were the deep subject matter experts. Because we could have great conversations about the business need with the senior leaders, but as soon as we start describing, the ins and outs of the LMS system or why we need an LXP, kind of left them behind somewhere. So we had to get into a space where we had the expertise to then also play in their business area needs. And it was also an opportunity for us to bring together this dispersed learning community across the business units. So they felt they had a home in the new strategy, they had a voice at the table, and they could also use their expertise. And we learned a huge amount from these guys. And candidly, there were some tough conversations to begin with. When we started talking about the 75 learning platforms, and I shared that I wanted to get to between 8 and 12 as a maximum, nobody wants to hear their baby's ugly, so everybody starts rapping onto their learning platform, and it'll go, go and talk to the neighbours, it's theirs is the one you want to switch off. But engaging them in this approach got buy-in, reduced the fear factor, and started them on the opportunity of just imagine what this could feel like in a future state world. What could this be like if we get this right? We then had an interesting challenge, was how do we balance cost? We'd had a chargeback model for all learning offerings previously, and it was less than ideal in that with intercompany charges, there are thresholds that finance set, and within our organisation, these were quite high, which meant that if I had to get a chargeback from a marketing company in France, if they had consumed less than the threshold, I couldn't actually get the chargeback from that company, which meant that I was left with a funding gap. So what we agreed was that we wanted a model that was flexible. The organisation grows and reduces. So we wanted a membership fee that said, if you pay me a membership fee, and we had the conversation with our C-suite, each of you as C-suite members pay me a membership fee by headcount based on a percentage of payroll, because in emerging markets, the salary is a lot less than in the US. As your population goes up and down, your fee will go up and down. But you will have unlimited access to everything we offer. There will be no cross-charging. If the company grows in headcount, my budget grows with the headcount in order to be able to service the needs of a bigger population. They really liked this model, and it's the model that we've ended up working with. But it allows us to create essentially a world-class offering without the complexities of constant cross-charging in the organisation. And it also means that we have an opportunity to drive efficiency because I know exactly what budget I'm working with every year. So in terms of some of the elements around agility, so one of the things was about how do we create agility in my organisation? And one of the key things around that was about leveraging procurement and the technology teams. These were pivotal and essential components of the organisation in being able to work alongside us on the contractual arrangements, on the decommissioning of systems, on thinking about the technical integration of how we brought all of this together and what that would look like. We talked about the governance boards I mentioned earlier, but the other and the final piece on that one was we also wanted to think about where could we move some of the more transactional work into a business services environment so that we weren't consuming expert time, knowledge, and thinking on transactional activity that could be done much better and more efficiently by another part of the organization. So some of the things we tried in terms of comms and change engagement was we wanted to work with agile principles. So really think about, what are you going to think big about? What are you going to start small? And what can you scale fast? So use everything as an experiment. We played with concepts even when we launched our LXPs. We started with 2 and we trialed them with 900 people in each trial. And we had the users give us the feedback. And honestly, the one that we actually went with is not the one I chose. We went with the one that essentially the population said, this is a better user experience and this is the one that we really like. And that meant that we had real user experience informing the decisions that we made. We had a big campaign, so we brought in some behavioral scientists, we borrowed some of our expert marketeers, and we built a campaign around learning for life and how we would engage with that. We set up trials. We had a trial of 300 people where we experimented with learning moments that could happen at different times of the day to get people thinking about, again, this is not a big deal. This is just about small incremental changes that would add up to big changes. And then we had business units running either weekly or week-long or month-long learning events to, again, bring the voice of learning culture to their work and the work they did so that people didn't feel like this was an HR initiative. This was something that was foundational to what AstraZeneca was doing. So as I mentioned, we had this beautiful 75 learning platforms that we needed to play around with. Our end game and what we were trying to achieve as an organization was something a bit more akin to, we all use devices for all sorts of things. The example I wanted to use for the company was, so if I have a MacBook, I have an iPhone, I have a cordless or wireless Apple mouse. If Apple bring out a new mouse, I don't need to change the laptop or my phone, I just change the mouse. I wanted an agile ecosystem that was plug and play, that was consumer grade, that allowed me agility in terms of how long I stayed with different pieces of the technology, but that it gave me this tiered experience that we could keep clean and integrated and connected with data. So the learner experience, so through the LXP, then looking at how would we use virtual assistants and chatbots, and I think the opportunity for us now is how do we use generative AI to start thinking about taking that to the next level. But it creates this one-stop entrance into the learning environment. Doesn't matter which part of the organization you are, you go in through one door. When you go through the door, you find the enterprise learning offerings, you find your business unit academy, and you find the things that you want to follow because you're curious about those and the learning communities you want to be part of. That then enabled us to translate that through the LMS, the LCMS, and how we're connecting GXP as our compliance environment. So it's again about thinking about how we build that compliance level in there. And then ultimately, it's about getting access to data, this dashboards component. So what we were finding was we were still using different types of tools for analytics, and we wanted to get to more standardization. We also looked at what tools the business were using, and we used Power BI as our way of navigating through that. But that means that now most of our vendors have switched to using Power BI, which means that bringing this data together becomes a real opportunity for us. And again, it creates the opportunity for storytelling. It creates the opportunity for insights. And when you have insights, you then can start to influence the organization. So some of the lessons learned. as I mentioned, agile mindset. We tried a lot of things. We failed a few. We dusted ourselves off, we picked ourselves up, we took the lessons, and we moved forward. We constantly use that experimentation model. As I talked about, embedding procurement and IT, I would say, are critical to the success because you can also ensure that you build good contractual arrangements, not just in terms of how you manage the contract, but what's been invaluable for us is I know the CEOs of every one of our major vendors. We have vendor days where we bring all the major suppliers in and we will walk them through the strategy, the latest business strategy. And what they found particularly valuable as well as us is they don't normally talk to each other either. So when they see each other in the room, it's been an interesting experience for them to be able to hear from others because they're not direct competitors, they're part of an ecosystem. And we found that some of the vendors have then gone and connected with each other outside of that conversation, but we get an opportunity to experiment with them. And I think one of the things that has been really valuable for us is, I think when we all go to a vendor, you've seen a service offering or whatever service they provide, and we ask for that service. Often these companies are very broad, cover lots of different services, maybe in other industry sectors or other areas. It's enabled us to hear the full story of what they can offer, not just what we asked for. And that creates some really interesting conversations. One in particular is we use LHH for coaching and feed forward. They bid for a piece of work in our service offering, were unsuccessful in that one piece of work, but actually allowed me to see some of the other offerings they provided. They're now our biggest vendor in another space. And we have a very strong strategic partnership with them because of these conversations being asynchronous and taking us off in some interesting directions. And when they launch new activities as part of their group, I have an opportunity to see and hear from them what they're thinking and what could we help them with. So it's created some very strong partnerships. The multidisciplinary approach and the deep technical knowledge I mentioned earlier, you need the skill in your team to help you navigate this. If you're reliant on somebody else, it's too removed from the problem, and it's also too removed from the opportunity to really navigate it. And that comes to the strength in the project management. The change in project management capability in the organization is critical to the success. And it's something that we've continued to build and evolve, but it's now become a foundational component of the team's abilities. So just to close out on a few final things. Shared vision and alignment. Help everybody, including the business, understand where you're going, what you're going to offer, what's it going to do. Keep your stakeholders connected. The governance board, I can't understate how important that is. They helped us through some really tough moments because they believed. They became a super voice out in the business when there were doubters or when there were sticking points in the transformation. Something our former CHRO used to say regularly was go slow to go fast. Know when you have to stop, pull over, deal with the issue, deal with the challenges, engage the stakeholders. Even if it frustrates the fact that you're not moving the program forward, this is critical. And we still talk about it today is, do we need to go slow to go fast? And ultimately, do what is the right thing. Sometimes it can seem like there's a shortcut. Don't do it. Never pays off. It just comes back and bites you a couple of days later. So if it feels like you should be stopping or you should be going a different direction, is listen to the inner voice that's telling you there's something not quite right. So these are some of the headlines of what we achieved. Was we were able to bring the cost for the organization, from when we started in 2019, the costs today are 20% less than they were in 2019. The population has grown 20% globally. The offering has increased 600%. We're now down to a fully connected ecosystem of technology. We've had over 3.2 million learning modules completed by the employees of the organization since we went live. We get regularly close to 90% positive feedback in the engagement surveys about people have an opportunity to learn and develop. But also what we've seen is retention. For individuals that have been through any one of the 14 different manager or leader offerings that we have, retention in that group is 50% more than the general population. People that have been through the development offerings are 25% more likely to be promoted. The data enables us to ensure that we have a 50-50 gender split in terms of participation in the programs. So we're driving engagement around inclusion and diversity. But what we're seeing is real stickiness in the organization, that people feel they're being invested in and they have access to learning, and we're seeing learning habits happening all the time. You see people are using the LMS, the LXP as a way of refreshing their skill sets on an ongoing basis. We've also built 25 different professional skill pathways and 21 business unit academies to build technical skills, which means that people now are being supported from a development point of view as an individual, a development as a leader, as a technical expert, but we're also bringing people together in terms of the connection to the purpose of the organization. And it's had a real impact in terms of what that means. So I'm thrilled that it was great that we were able to get recognition internally, but what we wanted to also do was benchmark ourselves externally. And we had a phenomenally successful last year, and this is great credit to the team and the work they did. But it also gave kudos to the team internally, so that we weren't drinking our own Kool-Aid, but it also helped the organization recognize that the investment was benchmarking well and was converting into meaningful examples that we could share with other organizations. But we also want to learn from everybody else's experiences. We're not done by a long way. So the last piece that we're working on, and this is the ongoing activity now, is Global Learning Services currently has about 80 people working in it. We're looking to expand this to about 140. But this is where we have essentially the LMS administrators out in the organization. This will give us the opportunity to really streamline content management, content editing, coverage in the overall, and how we drive that forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was super interesting. So before we go into questions, and you can start thinking about your questions, before we go into audience questions, I have one question that I wanted to ask myself. Given the broad tech theme of this transformation, why did you go with the tech ecosystem that you did?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, what I was looking for is agility. I think we all see the speed of technology changes so rapidly. And having looked at our experiences of implementing a human capital management system, so we have Workday in AstraZeneca, moving to Workday and setting up Workday was an enormous piece of work for the organization. But there are also challenges when a system is that large and that connected into the organization, that you're kind of committed to that platform for a long period of time. And the same could be true of many LMS systems. And where I wanted to be was in a space where we had the agility to constantly work with what was the latest technology and not be more than 2 to 3 years out on a contract that enabled us to move into that space. Now, as a highly regulated and compliance industry, we are never going to be the first adopters. We just can't afford to be the first adopters. We have to take a risk-managed approach to it, but being the fast follower is where we'd want to be. So therefore, the ecosystem gave us the agility to be in that fast follower space where it suited us and if it was something that we needed. And that ecosystem has given us that and continues to give us that as we move forward.
Thank you. So we have 20 minutes for questions. Who wants to start? Now, here we go. There's a mic over here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for a really inspiring presentation. So you mentioned the GXP environment, and knowing AstraZeneca, you have a huge population within production. So I'm curious as to your experience when introducing a new learning culture, building on some of the same ideas about mindset and driving it and democratizing learning, when approaching that very big part of your target group.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is a clear upside and a downside. The upside, so our supply manufacturing organization is about 17,000 people across 32 manufacturing facilities. The beauty of it is the culture is one of lean. So if you think of the Toyota production system, whatever they do, they implement it, they refine it, and then they scale it rapidly. But there is very high adoption and compliance to that once it's been launched. So the upside for us was you had an organization and a population with a mindset that if they know it works and it will drive efficiency or benefit and value, adoption will be rapid. The challenge is the risk adversity is much higher than it is in any other part of the organization. So before they let go, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement required to give them assurances through piloting, through the experimentation, through high degree of stakeholder engagement, to give people the confidence to say that when we press the live button, they have assurance that we're not going to create a situation that could cause an audit output or a regulatory failure. So it's been a much slower process, and the approach that we took was that's the area with the highest complexity, so we left it until last. We worked through every other business unit first, learned all the experiences, all the lessons learned, got a few things wrong, and now we're going through the final stages of the GXP environment now. Now we have buy-in, and we can say, here's 20 other examples we've already done to give you assurance. But we're not there yet, but we're on the way.
Thanks for the presentation, Mark. It was great. How did you guys deal with probably the biggest challenge, which is, I'd love to learn. I love learning. I just don't have time.
Yeah, I've had that question a few times. I think it's a mindset question in part. Part of it's also about capacity, and part of it's also about giving permission. In the main, I would say that we've been able to encourage people to think about learning as an investment in themselves, and that how do you continue to unlearn, relearn, upskill, new skill. And it's an investment in your continued relevance and agility from a career perspective, but also in terms of your contribution and the value you add. And many people engage with that as a conversation point. I think the challenge is primarily for the population we were just describing in manufacturing. So if you're a production employee and you're working on a production line, you turn up for a shift, you start your shift, there's a shift debrief, then you're on a production line, you're in a very controlled environment of activity, and how do you create space? Because you can't just go and play on a laptop somewhere for 10 minutes. we've had to think about working with the supply chain team to create capacity in the scheduling to allow for people to step off the line and learn, or to create. Now, one of the benefits of the COVID environment was, because of the isolation and the separation needed, we ended up implementing a rollout of iPads across the whole of the supply and manufacturing environment so that people could work independently without having to come together too closely to keep the space. That's given us an opportunity to leverage that technology with the learning. But it also is about getting senior leaders to role model the conversation about how are they learning, how are they using learning moments without thinking of it as I need half a day to go and attend a course, is how do I gain 10 minutes to just refresh on a skill? And I would say honestly, we haven't solved it, and the question's never going to go away. But I also tried an experiment with my own team, which was I gave them an hour a week on a Friday to say, I'm giving you permission to block out an hour of your own diary in work time to invest in learning. And what I found is some used it, some didn't. Because some preferred to do their learning when they'd gone home, they'd had dinner with the family, they'd put their kids to bed and they had a quiet moment, versus doing it in the day. Others prefer to do it if they're traveling on the train to work or listening to a podcast in the car. So I don't think there is a fixed solution to it, but it's about creating the appetite for learning and the access to learning and make it as enjoyable, as consumer grade, and as energizing as you can. And the rest is about role modeling.
Thank you. Hi, Mark. That was a really inspiring session. Having been in pharma learning since the turn of the millennium, there's obviously a massive shift in the expectation of learning professionals. And you talked a lot about expecting them to partner, influence, really understand the business. So I'm really interested to understand what you did to support the capability development of your own internal learning team.
Yeah, so we tried to bring the whole community together. So I have a team of 64 people in my global function, as well as the people that I have in Global Learning Services. But then more broadly, there's probably another 150 people across the organization that are involved in learning in some capacity or other. We brought them together, and part of the methodology was about sharing the vision, the purpose, and where we were trying to get to, involve them in the skills and capabilities conversations that we were having, but also get them to think about the questioning skills, how they were diagnosing, and also how do they translate that into a demand signal that we could then use and convert. So what are they hearing? And it was trying to sort of filter out, not jumping to every new request in a way that we're a concierge service and we've got to meet it. Sometimes the customer knows exactly what they need. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they need a little bit of a performance consulting conversation that breaks down the what is the demand signal to an actual defined need, and then helping them understand where is that need, or where could that need be met in the current offering. And if it's not being met, are we then hearing those signals from anywhere else? That means that we can respond to that with a broader global offering. And we've done that a few times.
Cool. Some skill sets require homogeneous training, kind learning environments. Now, in areas like customer service, where, wicked learning environments where homogeny could be potentially damaging in certain regional, contextual specificities. How did you create the autonomy in those areas to identify and choose learning interventions that were specifically relevant to them, where homogeny could be damaging?
So one of the things that we did, because your question and the topic was one of the early conversations that we had in looking at the governance model. And when we were talking to the Enterprise Learning Board, a lot of the leaders were saying, well, you know, I've got 10,000 salespeople that I need to develop selling skills or marketing skills, and your global function isn't going to be the expert in that area. We should be doing that ourselves. We agreed a federated operating model where my team and I would work on whatever was core and common to the whole population, we would own. We would own the technology, and we would own the governance and the creation of core and common content. And anything related to manager or leader development, we would own. But anything that is technical skills based or specific to a business unit, their learning teams, their learning academy would be the home for that content, because they're closer to the need. Generally, they are more expert in that area. But if there is an opportunity to bring the two together, then we would support them on an ad hoc basis. But essentially, we would give them the freedom to operate in that space. And we do that with the operations team, with R&D, with sales and commercial, finance, whoever it may be. They then feel a greater sense of ownership and alignment to their business goals. And then they feel happy drawing down on the global offerings to complement that.
Hi, Mark. I just wanted to ask, so you talked about C-suite and bringing them along for the journey. And I know that that's something I'm sure a lot of us have had mixed successes with over the years. What did you find was the biggest barrier with bringing them along to the journey, and how did you overcome it?
Just giving me flashbacks to the business case pitch. One, its intention was to underpin the business strategy. So it was a key enabler to realizing the business strategy in having an agile population of employees that were learning, developing new skills, growing towards our future need, and meeting the talent pipeline. The biggest challenge was actually describing the current landscape, because it was so broad and complex. They wanted to know, what are we doing now? And when you laid it all out, it was a bit of a horrible mess. And they wanted to know how we were going to go from there to where we were going to end up and what we were trying to achieve. I think the piece that really sold them on the concept was, I talked to them about creating a Netflix of learning for the employee base. And I tried to connect them to something that they may have experienced personally without getting lost in the science. But by sharing that sort of Netflix vision, Netflix and Spotify, I played around with both concepts, they could get the personalized learning, the augmented learning experience, how it was centered around the individual, but how it would also allow nuances on the individual's learning preferences to play out. The bit that intrigued me was that they weren't obsessed with the cost. They could see how much we were spending. They wanted more value, and they wanted greater experience, and they wanted something that would retain talent. And we were fortunate in being one of 6 strategic projects that were funded by the CEO after the bidding process. So 20 projects went in, and this included science, commercial, and we were fortunate that we got one of the funding. And I got half of what I asked for. Nearly got less, managed to get them just back up before we closed the call. And I thought, that's enough to get us off the ground. Let's prove the concept, and let's see if we can mobilize some believers. And we did that. But what I did see was, after we produced the first impact summary, which took 2 years for us to be able to get at the data, after they saw the data, never looked back. It's taken off phenomenally. They are now advocates. They are constantly asking for how they could be sponsors or how they could talk to the messaging, because they see the value of retaining the talent, attracting people, the value proposition to an employee, and how it creates belonging to the organization's purpose. The experiences are creating connectivity. Now it's about how can we get more efficient and continue to drive it. But yeah, we had a few tough conversations, and I never forget when the CEO said to me, he gave me the number he was going to give us, and my CHRO was sat opposite me, slightly off camera on a Zoom call, and she said, just end the call now, let's run. And we just said thanks and dropped the call and thought, right, I'm not going to risk extending the conversations because I could lose a couple of million here.
And we have time for one final question over there.
You mentioned working on defining 25 skill learning path, and I really like the naming, because I'm still hearing a lot about career path. I still see sometimes a huge focus on job title. Can you tell us a bit more about your approach here?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit. If you could repeat that, please.
Yeah, can you tell us more about how you move from being focused on career or job title to more skills and competency based? It feels like what you describe is that you're actually moving toward that space.
Yes. I would say we're not there yet. We are still thinking about it. What we tried to do was, as we looked at building the ecosystem and the content, we tried to think about the concept of skills and how we would get there, how it would connect back to, we've used strategic workforce planning, but how do we move to more of future skills forecasting, and look at the volume of skills that we have internally versus what we need, so that we could then direct people towards the learning content that was relevant. One of the decisions that we took was to use a platform called Realize It as an adaptive learning platform to complement the learning technology and the learning experience platforms, so that it would start to build around the learner when we knew what skills we needed. The bit that we haven't yet achieved is we don't have a consistent taxonomy of skills yet. Every vendor's working on one. There are some versions internally that the business units have started to develop, but we need a consistency around that so that then we can have common language and common reference points within the technology to search for it. And I think that will be the opportunity for us. The question it will lead to is, I think it will force us to look at how the whole global HR function is orchestrated and whether we need to change to be more end-to-end skills driven in the way that we think about talent philosophy end-to-end, and also how do you organize around experiences on an end-to-end basis. And that might challenge the configuration of the centers of excellence and the operations environment. So these are the questions that we're still wrestling with, and we're not there yet, but would love to hear examples of what other organizations are doing.
Thank you so much. We're just finishing on time. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your journey and your earned insights with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.